Welcome back to Hanover for reunions. My name is Robin Albing. I'm with the Office of Alumni Relations, and our team in lifelong learning creates educational programs for Dartmouth alumni, family, and friends around the world, across the U.S., and in Hanover during reunions and homecoming. We're really excited to have you here today. If you would like to review some of our other programs, please check out our website on the Alumni Relations website, and you can learn all about the educational programs that we have. Today, we are very, very pleased to welcome Professor Jeremy DeSilva here for the talk, Underground Astronauts, the Search for Human Fossils in South Africa. Your feedback today is particularly important to us, so when you get back home, you're going to get an electronic survey. Please fill that out and give us your comments. We'd love to know about that. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Jerry DeSilva is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. He received a BA from Cornell University and his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is a paleoanthropologist specializing in the locomotion of the first apes, hominoids, and early human ancestors, hominins. His particular anatomical expertise, the human foot and ankle, has contributed to our understanding of the origins and evolution of upright walking in the human lineage. He has studied wild chimpanzees in western Uganda and early human fossils in museums throughout Eastern and South Africa. From 1998 to 2003, Jeremy worked as an educator at the Boston Museum of Science and continues to be passionate about science education. When he is not studying fossil foot bones or lecturing on human evolution, Jerry and his wife Erin are busy with their 5-year-old twins, Benjamin and Josephine. Last year, Jerry was part of what National Geographic has called one of the greatest fossil discoveries of the past half-century. And today he's going to share that story. But before he starts, I want to give one very shameless plug, because our Office of Lifelong Learning is also the office of Dartmouth Alumni Travel. So those brochures that you receive sometimes, those come from our office. Please don't throw them away. One thing I want to tell you about is that next year in 2017, Jerry is going to be leading a trip to South Africa. So if you like what you hear today, it would be an incredible trip to go on with Jerry. Without any further ado, please welcome Professor Jeremy DeSilva.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Robin, for a really nice introduction. And welcome back, everyone. So as Robin said, I'm an anthropologist here at Dartmouth, and I study human evolution by examining the fossil records. I'm a paleoanthropologist, not quite a paleontologist, a little bit of anthropology, combine them together, and I'm a paleoanthropologist. So I am obsessed with fossils. I love fossils, and I love thinking about where we came from. I love thinking about the story of human evolution. And when I say that to you, when I say human evolution, very often the first image that pops into your head is something like this, right? If you Google image human evolution, this is what comes up. Now, this is a problem because scientists who work on human evolution know that this is not how things unfolded. That guy over there is not the pinnacle of human evolution by any means whatsoever. And you can think about, where did this come from? Why do we have this kind of imagery? Where do these icons come from? And it actually goes back to 1965 in this wonderful Time Life book called Early Man. And this was called The March of Progress. And it was a new way to illustrate how human evolution may have worked. And it's been adopted ever since, 50 years now, of folks thinking of human evolution with this kind of icon in mind. And of course, there are all these really fun plays and ways of thinking about this, right? That, what are we turning into? Well, we're turning into a population plagued with obesity, or we're turning into folks too reliant on technology, or we're turning into Sith Lords, right? So there are all these really wonderful imageries that we can have fun with, but if we go back to this original one, what it implies is that humans came from chimpanzees, and that's not what evolutionary biology predicts whatsoever. Chimpanzees are our cousins. They live today. They're our relatives. We didn't come from them any more than they came from us, right? Instead, we are closely related to them, and we share a common ancestor. Okay? Now, this common ancestor was neither a human nor a chimpanzee. Both of these spectacular lineages that exist today, humans and chimpanzees, evolved from this common ancestor. Now, the DNA evidence can tell us who our closest living relatives are, chimpanzees and bonobos. It can also tell us when, more or less, the common ancestor existed, about 7 million years ago. But only the fossils, only the actual physical evidence can show us how we changed from the common ancestor into what we see in the mirror today. Okay? So this sets up a really nice prediction or a nice test of a hypothesis of evolutionary theory. That if, in fact, this is true, if humans and chimpanzees are closely related to each other and share a common ancestor, then we should find fossils of things that are neither human nor chimpanzee in sediments, presumably in Africa, dated back to about 7 million years ago. These are the so-called missing links, right? You've all heard about the missing links. And one of the secrets that often you're not told is that the missing links aren't missing. We've got lots of them. We've got thousands of fossils, literally thousands of fossils of things that fit this gap between humans today and chimpanzees today. Now, some of you may recognize Lucy. There's the very famous Lucy skeleton right there. But look at all the friends she's surrounded by. You've probably never heard of any of those. We find more and more and more of these all the time. And in fact, we are in a golden age of paleoanthropology, where I was telling folks a moment ago that we have effectively doubled the human fossil record in the last decade. And so a lot of these new discoveries are allowing us to rewrite the narrative of human evolution. And in part, that's because even though we have thousands of fossils, we're talking about millions of years. And a million is 1,000,000. So even if you have 1,000 fossils, you really only have a fossil for every couple of thousands of years. So imagine if I took your jaw and used it to represent all of humanity for the last 5,000 years. We'd be missing some stuff, right? We'd be missing some information. So new fossil discoveries always help us fill in those gaps, and sometimes they really do force us to rewrite the family tree in our own family tree. And I'm going to tell you about 2 such discoveries today. But before I do that, I want to give you the big picture, right? What do we think happened in terms of the big picture of human evolution? Well, we know that humans and chimpanzees are closely related and descended from one another about 7 million years ago, or descended from a common ancestor, I should say. The very earliest members of our lineage are animals we call Ardipithecines, or root apes. And we gained some really nice insight into what these creatures were like thanks to a discovery in Ethiopia that was made about 20 years ago of a skeleton called Ardi, or Ardipithecus ramidus. And Ardi has a relatively small brain, about the size of a chimpanzee brain, but its teeth are much more like yours and mine. It has these small, dull canine teeth. Most primates have pointy fangs for their canines, and humans don't. We've got these wimpy little canines. And it turns out that goes way, way, way back to the earliest members of our lineage. The Ardipithecines also were very comfortable in the trees. They had grasping toes, they had long arms and long curved fingers, but there are aspects of their hip joint and their foot that tell us that when they came down on the ground, they could move on 2 legs. They did not knuckle walk. So the beginnings of bipedalism, of this really strange form of locomotion, starts with the Ardipithecines. By 4 million years ago, the Ardipithecines evolved into a group called the Australopithecines, represented here by Lucy, the famous Lucy skeleton. They lived in Africa from 2 to 4 million years ago, and they mastered bipedalism. They start walking around the landscape, not that differently from you and I do, but as we find more and more and more fossils of these creatures, what we find is wonderful bipedal variation. It turns out different species moved in different bipedal ways. So it's sort of like the cantina scene in the original Star Wars. It's 2 Star Wars references now. Sorry about that. Where all these different forms of bipedalism. And we think that's what the world was like from 2 to 4 million years ago, with these different experiments going on with these Australopithecines. By 2 million years ago, Australopithecus evolved into the genus Homo. These are things that have larger brains, smaller teeth, more reliance on technology, longer legs, and with those longer legs, larger territories, and they not only expand and fill up Africa, they migrate out of Africa. They head into Europe, and in Europe they evolve into Neanderthals. They head into Asia. But then back home in Africa, 200,000 years ago, they evolve into us. Homo sapiens, things that are indistinguishable anatomically from you and I, are discovered in sediments in Africa that are upwards of about 200,000 years ago. Not that long ago, given this time frame of 7 million years we're talking about. Okay? When those Homo sapiens expanded throughout Africa, there was a small group that left Africa, went into Europe, bumped into the Neanderthals. Turns out that they made babies with them and absorbed them into the human population. We now know that because of genetics that have been extracted from Neanderthal bones. They went into Asia and interbred with a population called the Denisovans that we only know from DNA from a tooth and a pinky bone. We don't know what they looked like. We assume they looked a lot like us because we interbred with them, but we don't know much about their actual fossil anatomy because we haven't found the fossils. It's a population we know mostly because of their genes, and their genes are in our genes today. It's a really fascinating story. So as we learn more and more about human evolution, things become more and more complex, which to us as scientists is a blast. So what I'm going to talk about today are two fossil discoveries, the first of which is a new form of Australopithecus, that kind of middle group I was discussing that lived in Africa from 2 to 4 million years ago. Australopithecus has been known to science for a long time. We've known about it since the 1920s. That guy over on the left is named Raymond Dart. He was an anatomist at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in the 1920s, and he was the discoverer of the original Australopithecus specimen shown on the right, known as the Taung child. It's a baby skull, or a toddler, really. It's a roughly 3-year-old individual. And he looked at this and studied this and noticed that the brain had some complexity to it, like you see in a human brain, even though it was small, that the spinal cord left the base of the skull, suggesting this thing held itself in an upright posture and maybe moved on 2 legs, and it had those tiny little canines. And he argued that this was, in fact, an early human ancestor. The way that he was able to extract this fossil from the surrounding rock was he used his wife's knitting needles to do it. That was the sophisticated technology at the time to free up fossils from their surrounding matrix. Now, since that time, there have been many fossils discovered throughout South Africa in an area known as the cradle of humankind. The cradle of humankind, which is illustrated here, is littered with cave sites. And if anyone has anyone been to the cradle of humankind? Right, so you can go, and there's a cave right here called Sterkfontein, and Sterkfontein does tours, and you can walk through Sterkfontein. It's a really wonderful area to visit if you ever have the opportunity. There are caves all over the place, and many of these have yielded extraordinary early human fossils. Now, one of these caves, right up here, I'll draw your attention to this one right there. It's called Gladysville. Gladysville is one of the more magnificent caves I've ever been in. As you go into Gladysville, there are fossils lining the walls of the cave. There are fossils everywhere, thousands of them. And a colleague of mine, Lee Berger, a colleague and friend, shown here on the right, Lee Berger worked at Gladysville for 20 years. And in those 20 years, he collected thousands of fossils. It's something on the order of about 20,000 fossils that he collected. Fossils of antelopes and wildebeest and warthog and baboons and elephants and giraffes. But he's looking for early human fossils, and in 20 years, he found 2. He found a tooth and a finger bone, and that was it. That's it. But he would keep going back to Gladysville because look at all the fossils in the walls. Eventually, I'm going to find more. Eventually, I'm going to find a skull of an early human. Eventually, I'm going to find a skeleton. It was a seductive kind of place that kept bringing him back. But every season, he would get more and more antelope bones. And he got frustrated with this, and he and his postdoc, Job Kibbe, who's shown on the left, they decided to explore the area in a slightly different way. They decided to look for new cave sites. Instead of going back to the old ones over and over again, let's find some new caves. And the way they did this was by utilizing Google Earth. So this is an animation, a fly-in, using Google Earth, heading into the cradle of humankind in South Africa. Now when we get there, it's kind of brown. It's light brown. This is classic Africa. Savanna environment, tall grass as far as you can see, acacia trees in the distance. But every once in a while, in this rather arid area, it's not a desert, but it's quite dry, is a cluster of trees. And the cluster of trees, they're going to be illustrated in this animation by these red stars. And the question was, where are these trees, they're olive trees and stinkwood mostly, where are they getting their water from? That was the question. This is an arid area, where are they getting their water from? And what Lee and the geologist he was working with realized was that water was pooling at the base of vertical cave shafts. Seeds would come flying in, would fall in, and the trees would sprout out of the caves. The trees were bullseyes. They were telling you where the caves were. Lee was able to get the GPS coordinates of each of these clusters of trees. He then went out on the landscape. He would go out on weekends. He'd go out with his son sometimes. He'd go out with his dog, Tao, and he would document the existence of these caves. He was able to find 300 new caves that nobody knew existed on this landscape. And many of them had fossils. One of them is right here. That's Malapa Cave. That's the first one I'm going to tell you about, Malapa. From the sky, it doesn't look like much. From the ground, it doesn't look like much. It's just a hole in the ground. That's it. And yet, right there, in that hole in the ground, 2 of the most complete early human skeletons ever discovered were found. And the best part of this story, I think, is that they weren't found by the great paleoanthropologist Lee Berger. They were found by his 9-year-old son. I'll let him tell the story.
This is where I found it, and here's a rock that looks about the same size as it. And when I turned it over a bit, there was the clavicle sticking out. But when I saw it, I didn't know it was a clavicle.
So Matthew, your father was working around here, right?
Yes, he was.
And you went off wandering.
Yeah, I just followed my dog Tao down here, and then a big rock caught my eye. So I called my dad over, and when he was about 5 meters away, he started swearing, and he came towards me. He was like, it's a clavicle of a hominid, and I was like, whoa.
So that was 8 years ago. That was in 2008. Matthew Berger is now 17 years old. He's now 6'5", a big guy, and is interested in going into paleoanthropology. He had a very good start. So in that chunk of rock that he found was, right, a clavicle. It was a collarbone. And many of the animals that I mentioned to you a second ago, antelopes, wildebeest, zebra, they don't have collarbones. So when you see a collarbone in the rock, you can immediately cross off all sorts of different kinds of animals and say, all right, this must be from a carnivore, it's not shaped right. It could be from a primate, and so now baboon or early human, and oh, it's got the shape that we see in humans. And so if you know your anatomy, you can very quickly tell what bones you're dealing with. And if there was any doubt, Lee then flipped over the rock to the other side, and on the other side was a lower jaw sticking out with that canine tooth. And it was blunt and dull like you find in early humans. So he knew right away he had an early human fossil. And his son, his 9-year-old son, had discovered just as many fossils as he had in 20 years at Gladysville in 5 minutes here. So wonderful, wonderful. And as they kept searching through, yeah?
Is the government controlling who can go over there and poke around in these areas, or can just anybody go?
Yeah, so the rules in South Africa are a little bit different, that if you find a fossil in South Africa, it belongs to South Africa. It does not belong to you. So the antiquities laws there are different than they are here. And so these fossils belong to the South African government. And they're, in order to work at this site, Lee and any researcher has to get permits from the government. And so that's what happened next. All sorts of permits were issued to begin to excavate at this site and see what else is there. And they excavated all these chunks of rocks. I wasn't part of the project yet when this was going on. These chunks of rocks all had fossils sticking out of them. This was extraordinary. But what I'll tell you is that this science, this isn't Indiana Jones here. We don't go into a cave and find some skeleton just lying there on the surface of a cave. The fossils are encased within fossilized soil called breccia. And this is nasty, nasty, nasty stuff to have to chip through. So all of those chunks of rock went to the laboratory at the university in Johannesburg. And under a microscope, we had preparators who worked with this material and used these tiny little mini jackhammers to slowly, grain by grain, remove the fossilized rock from around the fossil. Okay? It's a little different from Raymond Dart using his wife's knitting needles. We've gotten a little more sophisticated. Now, this takes a lot of time, and you also can waste time if you're chipping away at rock that doesn't have a fossil on the inside of it. So it'd be really nice to see the inside of these rocks. And here's an example of that. Here's one of these chunks of rock. Here's a chunk of breccia. And it has an arm bone right there sticking out. It's a right humerus. It's its bone right here. And a careful eye, if you're looking around that rock, very careful eye. I have my students sort of look at this for a while and see if they can spot it. There's a tooth right there. sticking out. Now, whenever you see a tooth, you say, well, it may be there in isolation, or it's attached to a skull, and that would be awesome. But you don't want to chip away at this and potentially damage what's inside. And so this chunk of rock was brought at night to a local hospital where Lieberger's wife, Jackie, is a radiologist. And she gave it a CT scan. And when they gave it a CAT scan, they looked on the inside, and that's what they saw. That's amazing, huh? So there's that tooth sticking out right there, and that's a skull right there. And you get the base of the skull. So now, with this information, the preparators knew exactly where to chip away. They knew exactly how to get that skull out of there. And what was revealed after several weeks of work was the most complete early human skull ever discovered. This one right here, an absolutely magnificent, magnificent specimen. This is a replica. The original I would be, cradling. I wouldn't. And I'll tell you about the replicas towards the end of the talk, all the replicas we've made. This skull is amazing. It's absolutely beautiful. And as we chipped away at all the other chunks of rock, it wasn't just the skull of one individual. It was the skeleton of two individuals, skeletons of two individuals. On the left, we suspect that we have an adult female, and on the right, we have a juvenile male. His growth plates aren't fused yet. He's still growing. His wisdom teeth haven't erupted yet. And he would be the equivalent of a human today of about 10 years old or so. The individual on the left has a more spacious pelvis, has smaller canines, and so we think female. And her wisdom teeth are not only erupted, they're all worn down. So we think this is an adult probably in her 30s when she died. They are lying right next to each other in the cave. We suspect they actually fell into the cave together. And this may very well be a mother and son, though that's exceptionally difficult to test in the absence of DNA, and we can't squeeze DNA out of rocks. And that's what these things have become. They're fossilized. So no DNA out of these things. But what was great is that their anatomy was something I'd never seen before. The anatomy was entirely different from what other researchers had ever discovered in a fossil of an early human before. And because their anatomy, their head-to-toe anatomy was so different, they were named a new species of Australopithecus, Australopithecus sediba. Sediba means wellspring in the local language. And those are the teeth you can see on the left and right. The adult female, there's the worn-down wisdom tooth, and here's just the socket for the wisdom tooth, not even erupted yet in that younger individual. This is around the time that I got involved with this project, and this was such a fun project to be involved with, because head to toe, we had a different kind of animal. We think moving in a different kind of way. The skull was brought to France. It was given a high-power X-ray at a site in an X-ray facility in Grenoble, France. And on the inside of that skull was the perfect fossilized replicate of a brain of that individual. It's not a fossilized brain. What would have happened is sediment filled up the skull in the exact same size and shape of what the brain would have been. So we have essentially a cast of the brain. Now, the brain is rather small. This is one of the few data slides I'll show you guys. On the x-axis is time, so that's 3.5 million years ago, that's today. Y-axis is brain size. Every dot represents an individual fossil. So we've got lots of them, lots and lots and lots of fossils, an unbroken chain connecting humans today all the way back to our ancestors in the past. Chimpanzees are represented by the red line here, a brain size about the size of a can of Coke, 385 cubic centimeters on chimpanzees. Australopithecus sediba has a rather small brain. Australopithecus in general have brains only about 20% larger than a chimpanzee's, and this is the beginning now of the brain increase. And so it's right at the base of that increase happening in genus Homo, in Australopithecus sediba. The hand of Australopithecus sediba is wonderful. The thumb is long and robust, and it would have allowed precision grip. It would have allowed the pad-to-pad grip that humans use today to do all the incredible things that we do. Chimpanzees can't do that. Sediba could absolutely do that. But the body was different. The arms were quite long. The shoulders were ape-like, suggesting it was still comfortable in the trees. The pelvis was different from anything I'd ever seen. So was the knee, so was the heel, and so was the midfoot. And I started working with a physical therapy team, so a physical therapist group, trying to assemble how did this thing move? How did this thing walk? And what we've argued is that this was engaging in a form of bipedalism we call hyperpronation. This gets a little technical. Anyone who runs knows about hyperpronation and that you shouldn't do it. But we think that this creature was landing on the outside of an inverted foot. And then its foot would roll in, and its knee would roll in, and its hip would roll in, and it would walk kind of in this awkward sort of way. Now, why did it walk this way? Well, we think the species is still equipped for climbing trees and living in the trees at night to get away from predators, and also where it was getting its food, and I'll get back to that in a second. But I was struggling with how to communicate this, with how to tell folks, whether it's students or in a public discussion like this, or even my colleagues, to demonstrate how this walk looks, so that others can test this idea, test this hypothesis, because I may not be right. We'll see. So what I've been doing is working with the Dali Center here at Dartmouth with a student, Amy Zhang, who's interested both in art and in science. And what she's been doing is working with video game software to animate this thing and bring it back to life. It's 2 million years old. I didn't mention that. It's 2 million years old. We dated the sediment surrounding the rock, surrounding the fossils, using uranium lead dating of the limestone. And so you have a creature walking again after 2 million years. It sends chills down my spine. I absolutely love this idea of bringing these things back to life. And working with a Dartmouth student as talented as Amy has allowed us to do that. This is just a prototype. She would be horrified at this. She's still working on this animation and getting it to look more accurate. Now, I mentioned a second ago that we have evidence that they're getting their food out of the trees. And you say, well, how do you know that? This skull is so well preserved, it still has food stuck between its teeth. So we thought that brown stuff there was just dirt, and you clean it off and make the teeth nice and shiny and white. There was a PhD student who had recently done her dissertation on plaque that was still present in Neanderthal teeth, and thought, well, hey, if they're present in Neanderthals, yeah, this is a lot older, but why not have a look? And sure enough, that is plaque. You scrape that off the teeth, look at it under a microscope, and it preserves these little remains of plant cells called phytoliths. And phytoliths are very resilient. They last 2 million years, and they have a specific shape depending on the plant cell they came from. And so we can tell that before he died, he ate fruit and leaves and bark, the stuff you get in trees. So he was presumably up in a tree eating, came down, moved, maybe with his mother, across a landscape, and we think they fell into this cave. There's evidence of breakage on the arms and the skull and parts of the elbow of these individuals. We think they fell into the cave, and that's how they died. Now, we now know that they weren't alone either, that the two of them were not the only ones present in the group. As we've gone through these chunks of rock, we have found evidence of an elbow. This is an elbow from an infant, roughly 1-year-old individual. This is an ankle from a toddler. And this is a shin bone from another adult. So we now have an infant, toddler, preteen, and 2 adults. It looks like we have a family group, and we may have more. And we're going to find out more as we continue to go back and continue to dig. This is an incredibly exciting site with a new species that we're going to be digging in the coming years. Now, to me, one of the most important and exciting aspects of this is that a beautiful structure has been built over that pit in the ground, over that hole in the ground that's shown here. And students from Johannesburg, school children, can now take buses up to this site, and they can watch the paleontologists as they excavate. And they can become inspired to do this themselves. Even perhaps more important for this audience is that we've been inspired to bring Dartmouth students. And so in the fall of this year, we are teaching a class called Anthropology 70, Experiencing Human Origins and Evolution. This has been funded through President Hanlon's Experiential Learning Initiative through DECAL. And we have been encouraged to not only teach the students, we just selected them, there are 15 students. We're going to teach them in the classroom in September, October, November about field methods and how it is you find fossils and how do you know it's a human versus a carnivore versus an antelope versus a wildebeest, any of those things. They're going to learn all the methodology, and then after Thanksgiving, we all meet in Johannesburg, and we go out to Malapa Cave and we dig. And so they're going to have this experience of actually digging at this site. And this is, again, being covered by President Hanlon's Experiential Learning Initiative through DECAL. So this is going to be fun. It's going to be really exciting to involve Dartmouth students in this incredible, incredible site. So that's kind of the halfway point. That was one fossil site that I told you guys about. But remember, Lee Berger found 300 new fossil sites, 300 new caves. So what about the others? And what about the caves that people already knew about? We need to explore those a little bit better too. This became this sort of daunting endeavor of, geez, there's a lot of work still to be done here. Where do I even start? And so what Lee did was he formed a relationship with the spelunking community. He reached out to folks that cave for fun. And he said, hey, here's my card. If you happen to bump into any fossils, any bones at all, I know you don't know anything about bones, but if you happen to bump into any bones at all, give me a call. Let me know. Well, in October of 2013, so this is almost 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, these two guys, this is Steve Tucker and Rick Hunter. These two guys are amateur spelunkers. They go out on weekends and cave. They were in a cave that was known to the world. This wasn't one of Lee's 300s. This is a cave called Rising Star Cave. People go there for caving experiences. And they decided to go into an area of the cave that they hadn't been to before. And there was this tiny little crevice there. And they squeezed through the crevice and down a chute and into a chamber. And down into that chamber, when they got into that chamber, they saw that. Remember I told you how we never find skeletons just lying on the surface of a cave? Here's a skeleton just lying on the surface of a cave. So Lee sent this picture to a number of us and said, what do you think? And I looked at this picture and thought, oh geez, this is a caver. This is a recent person who died, because we don't find fossils just lying on the surface of a cave. But the aspect of the anatomy that changed my mind were the teeth. Okay? Humans today have very small wisdom teeth. It doesn't feel that way when they're coming in, but our wisdom teeth are actually the smallest of the molars. The first molar is the biggest, then the second molar is usually smaller, then the third one's usually smaller. So we have a gradation of our molars where it goes the biggest is the first, then the second, then the third. Our ancestors, it was the other way around. The third was the biggest, the second was smaller than that, and the first was the smallest. You can look at this jaw and see that that third molar is bigger than the second and bigger than the first. And so it has the gradation of an ancient species. But there it is just lying vulnerable on the surface of a cave. And so it was realized quite quickly that an expedition needs to be launched that can get this skeleton out of here and protect it as soon as possible, because this is valuable to science, but it's just lying there and could be quite vulnerable to the elements. Now here's the problem. Rick and Steve don't know anything about bones. They found this, they took this picture, this is great, but they don't know anything about properly excavating fossils. We needed people who knew how to excavate. We needed people who could get fossils out of the ground. We needed people who knew the difference between a human bone and an antelope bone and a zebra bone and a baboon bone. So we needed somebody who had a degree in archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, geology, something like that. We needed somebody who had caving experience, who wasn't going to go in here and freak out. Okay, so that eliminates me. There's no way I'm doing that. And we needed somebody who could squeeze through that gap in the rock I told you about. What I didn't tell you was that it was only 7 inches wide. 7 inches. So that sounds crazy. I want to show you what that looks like. So then on the other side is something called the chute, and that's a 40-foot drop, right on the other side. Now that chute, fortunately, is tight enough that you can treat it like a chimney and kind of wiggle yourself down. It's not a free fall, but still. So how are we going to find these people, right? Who has that set of skills, and how are we going to find them? And Lee Berger came up with the answer. He figured it out. He put an advertisement on Facebook. He said, I'm looking for skinny scientists. I'm looking for skinny scientists who know how to excavate, who know their anatomy, who can come to South Africa at the drop of a hat. Just drop whatever you're doing and come to South Africa for 3 weeks for an excavation. People who have caving experience, and you need to be able to squeeze through this 7-inch gap between these rocks. And he found, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but he found, as far as I'm concerned, there's 6 human beings on Earth who fit this criteria. And there they are. These are what I call or what folks have called the underground astronauts. And that's why I titled the talk, The Underground Astronauts. 6 women. These 6 women scientists came to South Africa in November of 2013 to excavate what we thought was a single early human skeleton. We thought it was a single skeleton just lying there on the surface of the cave. They went into this chamber, they went into this cave, they explored this cave, they trained quite a bit with cavers who knew the area pretty well. This was done in as safely a way as possible. And this is what they had to do. So this is where they start, right up here. And then you walk in, and this is where I stop and turn around. But they keep going. And the first real problem is Superman's crawl. Superman's crawl is only 10 inches high, and you have to go through like that, which is why it's called Superman's crawl. So you get the Superman pose, and off they go through. Then they get to Dragon's Back, which is filled with all these jagged rocks. That's the 7-inch squeeze, and there's the 40-foot fall into the chute, into the Denolitic chamber. And the Denolitic chamber is where all the fossils are. Okay? Now, after they get the fossils, they got to come back out. Keep that in mind. You got to go up the chute, through the 7-inch gap, and back down Dragon's Back, back through Superman's crawl. They got so good at this that they could do it in 20 minutes. It took them 20 minutes to get down into the chamber, more to get back out. This is the kind of environment they would work in. Lights were put down there. Video cameras were put down there as well. There was also oxygen or CO2 detectors that were put in there to make sure that they had enough oxygen. These were incredibly difficult conditions, and they were amazing. They did absolutely incredible. So every time you see a flag, they would find a fossil and put a little flag in. And then these are their digging tools there. So you got a plastic spoon. There's a tiny little, almost like a little dental equipment. They've got toothbrushes that they would use. So we don't go to fossil sites with shovels. Yeah, that's a big misconception. We go with these tiny little tools to get the bones out of the ground. And everyone who couldn't fit in there watched it on TV. That's everyone else just observing and also giving recommendations of what fossils to go after in what order. So they would get a fossil, wrap it up in bubble wrap, and then put it into like a little lunchbox. And once the lunchbox was full, somebody would carry it up the chute. You get to the top of the chute, it would be handed off to a researcher who couldn't fit down there but wished they could, and they would go through and document the anatomy of the bone. What bone is this? It's a mandible, it's an ulna, it's a femur, or something like that. And that's how this would go for 3 weeks. And what I loved about this was that it was live tweeted. So that the world, the folks who knew about this was on National Geographic's website, and those who sort of had the right timing and saw this could follow what was going on. It was the first time in the history of our science that we could actually invite the public into a great discovery, because usually discoveries are really, they're lucky. You just stumble upon something. So the Lucy discovery, for instance, they didn't know they were going to find Lucy that day, but we knew this day we were going to excavate the skeleton of an early hominin. And so the whole thing was tweeted. And so here we have the statement of staring at a beautiful mandible fragment with dentition, science tent is all smiles. So I want to show you what those smiles look like. They're really telling. So here's Lee Berger's smile. And then Lee hands the mandible off to his craniodental expert, a person who has studied mandibles and teeth for his entire career, Daryl DeRuyter at Texas A&M. And here's Daryl's smile. This thing didn't look like we thought it should. It didn't look like it should from the picture. This thing was different. Nobody had ever seen this kind of anatomy before again. This was a different kind of creature yet again. And meanwhile, more and more fossils keep pouring out of the chamber. And soon, what the underground astronauts found, so this is Becca and Marina, and what Becca and Marina ended up excavating on day 2 was a second right femur. Nobody has 2 right femurs. And once you get a second right femur, you got a second individual, and we have multiple individuals. It's not one skeleton down there, it's multiple skeletons. And then sort of it's, well, how many? How many do we have down there? And they kept saying there are more bones down there. There's so many bones down there. So by day 5, 100 fossils had been pulled out of that cave. Now this doesn't sound like a lot. You say, well, I have 206 bones in my body. 100, 100 doesn't sound like a lot, but I put up this image here to give you some perspective on how rare human fossils are. That's Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. It's one of the most famous early human fossil sites ever found. Most people have heard of Olduvai Gorge. That's where the Leakeys really made their name. And at Olduvai Gorge, folks started working there in the 1930s. It really picked up pace in the 1950s and into the 1960s. That's when the Leakeys were doing most of their work. So we're talking about 50 years of constant excavation at Olduvai. And in 50 years, they found about 100 human fossils. So that's about the pace. That's about how often we find these things. About 100 fossils for every 50 years, so 2 fossils a year. And it's a good season if you've pulled that off. We matched that in 5 days. So this was an extraordinary kind of site. And meanwhile, we kept finding fossils. 500 fossils. And then it was 1,000 fossils. And at some point, Lee said, all right, we're done. We have enough. And the underground astronaut said, but there's still more down there. And he said, we got to find out what these things are first. So he shut down camp. This is the last image that was tweeted. And maybe the lighting's not great, but you can see that's a row of teeth right there. That's a jaw. Those are ribs. It's a femur sticking out of the ground. In March, Becca and Marina went back down in there. They got that jaw, and they also excavated a complete hand and a complete foot. So we now have 1,500 fossils. We have effectively doubled the entirety of the human fossil record. Doubled it in a month-long excavation. 1,500 fossils. Absolutely extraordinary. And this is what they look like all laid out. Now, those 1,500 fossils, we now know by studying these bones very carefully, come from 15 different individuals. We have juveniles. We have lots of children in this collection, which is incredibly unusual to have fossils of children. And we have lots of older individuals, and we do have some prime-age adults, though not nearly as many. It is an extraordinary set of fossils. I've never had an opportunity to work on fossils like this before. This was mind-blowing. To go into South Africa and see this many fossils lying there on the table, it was overwhelming. Where do you even start? Usually I would go down there and spend 2 weeks to study 5 fossils. And here I had 100 leg bones and over 100 foot bones to work on. I didn't know where to start. Where do you even begin? Yeah?
You said, in that picture, the one before, you have like a human skeleton like that. Is that different bones?
Different bones. That's a composite. That's a composite. Yeah, the bones are all jumbled together down there. We have hands in articulation. I'll show you an image of that in a second. We have feet in articulation. We have some bones that we know go together, but it is so densely packed with fossils that an arm from this individual, mixes up with an arm from that individual, and we get these skeletons all jumbled. It's an unbelievable jumble of fossils. Yeah. I'll get to that. Yeah. But so that's exactly what we were wondering, is how in the world do you get this many bones, this many fossils in one spot? Let me tell you guys about the anatomy, and then I'll move to this really, really strange circumstance of how these bones all accumulated together. So we had this big problem of how are we going to study these things and get them out to the world in a reasonable amount of time. There's decades of work here. These are dissertations here that need to be done. But we didn't want to spend the time doing that. We wanted to get these out to the public as soon as possible, but we wanted it to be done well. So what do? Well, you invite more people. You just get more people, more recent PhDs, get as many young scholars as possible who are hungry and have data sets, and all they want are new fossils to work on, and get them to South Africa. So Lee really convinced the South African government to hold a workshop, and 60 researchers, recent PhDs, came to South Africa for a 6-week workshop. And we just said, let's figure what this thing is. Let's figure it out. And that's what happened in May and June of 2014. This is the skull team, led by Heather Garvin right in the center. She's at Mercyhurst, and she worked on the skulls and the teeth for that time. This is the thorax team, led by a guy from Spain, Marcus Pasteur, shown in the middle, trying to figure out how those vertebrae and ribs come together. Let's reconstruct the chest and the thorax. I was working on the leg and the foot of this thing. We had another researcher from the UK working on the hands. We had people from all over the world descend on South Africa to put this creature back together again. And this is what we came up with. The skull is incredibly small. We have a brain size of this creature of about 500 cubic centimeters, which is a little more than a third of your brain size. Okay, so this is Homo, well, I'll tell you the species name in a second. So this is the brain size here, which hopefully you can see is smaller than mine. A little snouty, but more or less this is a very human-like shape to the skull, and this is an adult, we can tell from the teeth. The teeth themselves are stunningly human-like. It's not real. Yeah, it's a replica. The teeth proportions are very human-like. The canines are very human-like. The incisors are human-like. The only difference, again, is that that third molar is the largest of the molars. And so that makes it a little more primitive. This is the last data slide I'll show you. On the x-axis there is tooth size, and on the y is brain size. And in general, in human evolution, our Australopithecus ancestors had small brains and big teeth. And then as you move through human evolution, in general, we get big brains and small teeth. And we think that diet and dietary changes, teeth, drove brain size changes in large brain size. So the bigger the brain, the smaller the teeth, the smaller the brain, the bigger the teeth. And that's how fossils have worked since we found them, until we found this thing. And this thing is different. This thing occupies that X right there, where it has small teeth and a small brain. We'd never seen that combination before, and it actually flies in the face of some really broad theories we have about how human evolution has worked in terms of brain enlargement. So that's fun for us to find something that doesn't quite fit the mold. The hand, again, quite human-like. This is the hand. And anyone is welcome to come look at these afterwards. The hand here has human-like proportions, a big, robust thumb, but the fingers are really, really curved. Again, suggesting some reliance on the trees, perhaps, at night. I've been working on the legs and the feet of this creature, reconstructing gait, reconstructing how it moved, and it moved a lot like us. It didn't move like that other thing I was telling you about. It's much more like us. Long legs. It has human-like joints in the hip and the knee and the ankle for the most part, and the foot is stunningly human-like, with the exception of both the individual we have this complete foot from and many others we have appear to not have much of an arch. And so the arch of the foot seems to be absent in these creatures, but the proportions and all the ways that these bones come together are like what you see in humans today. Once again, it was a combination of anatomies we had never seen before. And so we named it a new species, and we called it Homo naledi. Naledi means star, and it's after the cave system where it was found, rising star, the rising star cave system. Naledi means star. And when you put muscle where we know muscle is, and you put skin where you know skin is, and then you apply a little artistic license to the reconstruction, that's more or less what these creatures would have looked like. And so that's the artistic rendition of Homo naledi. This came out in September of last year. And when it came out, I figured people would be interested in it. I had no idea it was going to explode the way it did. This was everywhere. This went viral. It was so much fun to have former teachers and former students of mine and cousins I'd never even heard of emailing me and saying, oh, were you part of that naledi thing? That was so cool. You know, it was above the fold in the New York Times. It was on the cover of National Geographic. And then you know you've made it big time when you're in the Onion. The timing couldn't have been better. I was starting here at Dartmouth in September. My first class was in September, and 2 weeks later, this enormous announcement comes out. And I was teaching the Introduction to Biological Anthropology course at the time. And when it exploded like this, my students were so interested in asking questions. I talked to the folks at DeCal who were interested in experiential learning, and I said, well, let's get Lee here. Let's get Lee here to talk to the students about this. And so in November, he came. And he gave a public lecture, and he gave a talk to the students, and then he had lunch with the introductory students. And he inspired these students, and these are many of the same students who are now taking Anthropology 70 in the fall and are going to go to South Africa. Like, they're hooked. So between these inspiring discoveries that have been made, I think we've made a real impact on some students that probably were just taking Anth 6 to satisfy some distribution requirement, and now that we've derailed their plans of being economists or something like that. I'm sure their parents are thrilled with me. So what is Homo naledi? Well, we don't really know. Homo naledi appears to anatomically fit the gap between an Australopithecus and Homo erectus. They were reasonably tall. The males, at least, were about 5 feet tall. The females were a little smaller than that. The proportions were like us, long legs, shortish arms. Very small brains, though, which is curious. Again, an anatomy we had never seen before. Where it fits on the family tree, we're not entirely sure. So there's Homo naledi with a couple of big question marks around it. And one of the reasons that we have these question marks is we actually don't know when Homo naledi lived. We don't have a date. Fossils don't come with labels. These things don't have, back pockets with licenses that we can look up when they were born or so. We have to rely on the geology around the fossils to date the fossils, to know when these things lived and when they died. And very often what we do is we rely heavily on the fossils of other animals found around the ones we're interested in. And we find zebra bones, and we find antelope bones, and we find warthog bones, and we say, oh yeah, this ancient warthog lived in this time period because we've dated it at this other site. And this ancient giraffe lived in this time period. And if you find the two together, then this must be about 1.8 million years old or something like that. You logic out the time period based on the bones of other animals. There were no other animals found in this chamber. 1,500 fossils and no other animals. Remember Gladys Vale at the very beginning, half hour ago, I was telling you about Lee's first site, where all he had were other animals and no early hominids. And now he's got the reverse problem of only fossils of early hominids with no bones from other animals, or at least no bones from any large mammals. And so this was a huge, huge mystery of how in the world did these fossils get down there into this chamber. And we puzzled this over, and we said, well, okay, maybe there was a carnivore that specialized on eating Homo naledis and grabbed them and dragged them down into this cave and munched on them. Okay, maybe it was that. Well, you'd see bite marks all over these bones, and we don't. So there are no bite marks. Okay, cross that one off. All right, maybe there was a catastrophic event. A whole bunch of Homo naledis walking across the landscape, and there's a really bad flood, and it washes them all down into this chamber. Okay, if that was the case, you'd have sticks and debris and rocks and junk from the surface also washed into the chamber. And instead, we have this fine, fine silt. We don't have any evidence of a catastrophic event. So then we said, all right, maybe they're the ones that went down there, and they got stuck, they got trapped, they were exploring, who knows what they were doing, and they got down there and they starved to death. Okay? If that was the case, all of the bones would be at the exact same geological layer, and they're not. They're piled on top of each other, and there's sediment between them, meaning that this happened over a period of time. We don't know how long, but it happened over a period of time. And the only thing we've been able to come up with, and we might be wrong, but this is how science works. You come up with a hypothesis, and then it's tested when you have more evidence. Right now, the hypothesis is that this was deliberate disposal of the dead. That a Homo naledi in the group would die, and they would carry that individual down into the chamber. The way they would do it is they would circumvent this region here. There's actually another way to get to Dragon's Back. So they would come to the base of Dragon's Back, walk up with the body, and shove it through here like a mail slot. And the bodies would then accumulate over time down in the naledi chamber. If this is true, if we're right, then we have an incredibly sophisticated behavior, a repetitive behavior, happening in a species with a stunningly small brain. And this is something that we often have restricted to only humans. Only Homo sapiens will dispose of its dead. And if we're right, then we now have evidence that a rather small-brained creature was already doing something behaviorally complex and sophisticated. It's a fascinating possibility, and we're still thinking of ways of testing it. Now, the last thing that I'll mention about the site itself, and then I have sort of finishing remarks, is that the cave itself has so much more to excavate. So we have excavated, or the underground astronauts have excavated an area about the size of a desktop in a cave about the size of this stage. Okay? And every other area is jam-packed with fossils. So that's illustrated here with those dotted lines. That's what was excavated. And every other area is packed with fossils. So if you can pull 1,500 fossils out of that little box, can you imagine how many more fossils there are? So there are many, 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 many more fossils still down there to recover. The other thing I want to mention is that these fossils belong to everyone. These fossils don't belong just to the South Africans. These fossils don't belong to the researchers who found them. These are our ancestors. They belong to everyone. And we've been really passionate about that. And so what we've done is we've laser scanned 100 of the best fossils, jaws and skulls and leg bones and foot bones, and we've made them freely available on this website, morphosource.org. So you can go to morphosource.org, and you can look up Homo naledi, and you'll have 100 fossils that you can then download, pull it onto your desktop, you can have it as your screensaver, you can rotate a fossil, you can bring it to a place that does 3D printing, and you can print out your own Homo naledi fossil. It's a really good gift for the holidays. That's what my family members are going to get. our Homo naledi jaws. And not again, Dad. So I mean, we really are passionate about making sure that folks know that these fossils really belong to everyone. These are the world's fossils. So this is the Montshire Museum right over in Norwich. And when Lee came, he donated a set of Homo naledi fossils, the skull and the hand and the foot. And these are so inspiring to the kids and to the adults, to everyone who go there and look at these fossils. Because really, I mean, these are telling us about us. These are telling us about the human story. So I'll end with the following observation, that these fossils, I've talked to you about 2,000 fossils today. These fossils from 2 different species, okay, brand new species that we didn't even know existed prior to finding the fossils. These fossils were discovered in one of the most searched areas on Earth for these things, right? And they were discovered by a 9-year-old and a couple of amateur cavers. So can you even imagine how much more must be still out there waiting to be discovered? This is a spectacular awakening. Should be to everyone, to students and to everyone, that there is so much more about our evolutionary history, about ourselves, about our world, and about our universe that we still don't know. So thank you all very much.
If you would just use the mic to ask questions, we'd appreciate it. So we'll take turns that way. Do we have some questions?
Yeah, so you told us about the length and the width of the space that was excavated. What was the depth that they excavated to get 1,500 bones out of?
It's about a meter. Okay. Yeah, not very deep. Not very deep at all. It still blows my mind that in that limited space they were able to pull up jam-packed. And it's made figuring out which bones go with which individual is incredibly difficult. You know, it's a fun mystery, though. My challenge when I got there was to take all of the foot bones and the legs and turn them into feet and legs. So which bones actually go together? And you apply a lot of the skills you learn in kindergarten about shapes. You know, that, okay, this shape goes with that shape, and you click them together, and oh, these two go together. And that's how you assemble these into actual skeletons. Things are looking up, however. There's additional information that we're getting from excavations that have happened since this, and it looks like we have some associated stuff. So there is going to be more. There's so much more. It's going to be fun.
Hi, this is a kind of stream of consciousness question. I apologize. Your thought is, or the hypothesis is that they were tossed in dead. Is there a chance they could have been alive when they were thrown down there? And if they were tossed in dead, would you typically expect to see some sort of cause of death? Would there be like signs of violence, whether an animal or another humanoid,
right.
or?
So there's no evidence of any violence. And that's something you can actually pick up on the bones reasonably well, because bones that are fresh break in a particular pattern, break in a way that are different than bones that have just been lying on the surface for a long time. They crack in a different kind of way. It's almost like if you're looking for firewood and you find a stick that's been out there forever, it just cracks easily. But you find a fresh one and it gets, you get a green stick, right? And it gets these green fractures. Bone does the same stuff. So you can tell the timing of a bone breakage based on that, and you can often tell in a forensic context whether it's something that was violent, whether it was done by humans or humanoids or done by a carnivore. You get the bite marks. No evidence of that whatsoever, but there is interesting patterns of damage on the bones that, to me at least, are consistent with the bones already being skeletonized and things then hitting them. So additional bodies coming in fits with that observation, and the bones cracking as a result of that. One of the other interesting things that we've observed is that the hand and feet people love this site. The vertebra people are not too pleased. And you'd think, geez, you got 15 individuals, and you got dozens of vertebra. You do the math, and there should be vertebrae all over the place, and there aren't. There are only a couple. There aren't many ribs either. The shoulders are damaged, and the pelvis is damaged. But the feet and the hands are gorgeous. Teeth are gorgeous. And we've talked to a lot of folks about this, and they said, well, this is consistent with open-air burials. That an individual who dies and is then kind of rotting not buried, but rotting on the surface somewhere, you get this kind of nasty brew in here, and it can damage the bones themselves that are in that vicinity, whereas hands and feet might mummify. They might dry up and mummify and keep all the bones in perfect orientation and keep them well preserved. So that actually fits reasonably well with the idea that the bodies were pitched in already dead, got in there, and then rotted in the chamber. But we have, there are forensic pathologists who look at insect damage on bones, who look at all sorts of things and they're working on this material now to try to answer these questions of what was the state of the body when it was, when it got into the chamber. However it did, what was the state of the body when it happened? Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I should, just.
I'll go ahead. Given the difficulty in accessing the chamber, once these bones were located, I wonder, why don't you just drill into the chamber?
Yeah. So, right, I'd love to go down there. So here the two reasons that was not done, but discussions are happening now on how to do it. The first was you don't want to ever disturb a context unless you really understand what's going on. So you want to keep it as pristine as possible. So you worry that if you did destroy an area just to gain better access to the cave, you've actually removed a key piece of the puzzle of how the bodies got down there, of what the chamber was like years ago, of how to date the system. So we worried about that. And so Lee made the decision, I think it was the right one, to not make any changes at all. The other big fear was that if you do some drilling, if there's controlled explosions to try to remove some of these chunks of rock, you could make the whole system unstable and you can get a cave collapse. And if we got a cave collapse with folks down there, that's just, I can't even imagine that. So we didn't even want to think about that. So it was kept the way it was. I don't want to say it wasn't dangerous, because it was, but the women became so skilled at doing this work that we became more and more confident that this was the right approach, at least for now. In the future, there are discussions on how to maybe widen some areas and make this more accessible.
So I realize that you can't date this latest find, but now you've had two new forms of early humans discovered in relatively close proximity. Is the latest thinking that they existed around the same time? You had just lots of versions of us, or could it have been more of a sequential thing, evolutionary,
right,
from an evolutionary perspective? What's the latest thinking
So with these two particular species, I don't know the answer to your question, but we do have well enough dated sites throughout Africa to show that multiple species of human coexisted throughout time. That the unusual thing is what's happening right now. That this is the strange part of human history, is that there's only one species of upright walking ape, and it's us. And there's not too much data on this, but I don't think it's too much of a coincidence that once Homo sapiens arrived on the scene, some of the others went extinct. We have a tendency to do that. We're very good at extracting resources out of our environment. We're really good at outcompeting competitors. And we would have had competitors out there. There would have been these other things. And we're really good at eliminating them. And I think that's likely what happened. There was a little species called Homo floresiensis that lived in Indonesia till only about 50,000 years ago, so quite recently. And then they went extinct. Neanderthals. Now, we interbred with Neanderthals, but you can tell anatomically the difference between a Homo sapiens and a Neanderthal, and then we move into their territory, and they're gone, but we're still here. The Denisovans in Asia were there, and they're not anymore. But now we are. So if you go back in time, though, you would have Homo erectus coexisting with a number of these species. You go back in time even further, and you have different species of Australopithecus coexisting, probably filling different niches, some more in trees, some more on the ground, some more in lakeshore environments, some more up in the hills. So they would have filled niches. Exactly how they interacted with each other, though, we have no idea. And it's one of the great questions that I think we have is, from an ecology standpoint, how do you fill a landscape with a bunch of things that are becoming better and better and better at exploiting their environments? Because that's what we do in our niche. So that's what we're finding, is there was, this idea of linearity of human evolution, that there was only one thing at a time, gone. Yep, the fossils are telling us an entirely different story. Yeah.
My question actually follows on nicely from what you were just saying, because when I first heard about this, I've been troubled about the size of that a creature with a brain size that small could be engaged in deliberate disposal of the dead. I'm an archaeologist, and I don't do paleoanthropology, but study enough of this stuff that it seemed very odd. So I have a theory that I haven't heard voiced, but could another hominid species have been disposing of these little guys in there, and we don't know. I mean,
we don't know.
Right?
We don't know.
It could be,
right, maybe.
Someone with a bigger brain who, had a relationship with these.
These things keep dying, and they keep attracting scavengers. Let's, get rid of them. Let's get them out of here. Right. Because we don't have any evidence of anything. It's hard to get into the heads of these things, if in fact this is what they were doing. There's nothing. There's no evidence of grave goods. There are no tools down there. There are no sort of strange bones showing up down there. You can tell that you have a human burial site because all of a sudden there's some antlers, next to the body, and it's like, well, how did that happen? Or there's this really beautiful quartz hand axe or something like that, and it's okay. That was deliberate. Nothing like that at this site. What we need to do to answer that question is date this site. We need to know when these things existed, to know who their contemporaries were, to know who may have also been doing this. And really to look at more of these fossil sites and figure out if these things were overlapping in habitat on the landscape with other species. Now, just to give you a heads up, we are very close to having a definitive date on this site. We're very close. We've used 3 methods to date the site. Independent labs around the world have been sent these samples, and we've now gotten the samples back or with their results. And the team will be close to submitting a publication very soon. The date, we're close on dates. There was a paper that came out just this week that only based on the shape of the skull, only based on the anatomy of the cranium, suggested that this was 900,000 years old. That was the argument, that it was 900,000 years old. So that's the ballpark we're probably talking about based on anatomy, but that assumes that our narrative is right. Because you can find something that doesn't fit the narrative, and that keeps happening in our field. And it means that things were a little more complex and interesting than we thought. So we'll see once we get the actual numbers in.
Cool, thank you.
I was wondering if the bones showed different ages of the individuals, or were they mostly adults?
They're all over the place. We have an incredible cross-section of ages represented. There are a couple of vertebrae from an infant. So we do have an infant in the collection, but not much of it. Little teeth as well, or tooth, the roots haven't even formed, just the crowns of a deciduous tooth. That suggests we have something of an infant. We have a number of children, ranging from, say, 3 years old up to about 7 years old. Disturbing number of children. I'm not used to working with kid fossils. Usually I work with fossils of adults or older individuals, and it's, okay, they live their life. And here we have these, 5-year-olds. And it's tough to work with, actually. They're fascinating, and they tell you about growth and development in the species, and they're really important, but it's hard not to feel something, when you're working with a little kid fossil. We do have some prime-age adults. So some adults who are early 20s, mid-20s, 30s or so, we have some of those, but not many. And then we have a large number of older individuals. And so the demographic pattern that we have actually fits a graveyard reasonably well. Before, if you go into any New England cemetery, right? And you see lots of kids and lots of elderly and not as many in between. And that's the same thing we're seeing here. So it fits that pattern of this being a deliberate disposal site. But I don't want to read too much into that. But that's what we're seeing, is kids and some adults, but lots of older adults. Yeah.
Given how many bones are still left and the publicity around the cave site, how is it being secured and keeping people from going in there now?
Yeah, so the 7-inch gap helps.
That's really
right?
it.
I think it wards off enough people. However, there are bars that have been placed in front of the entryway, so you can't even get into the entry unless you have a key. and just the university has the key to get in. So it's very difficult to gain access. Also, the land that it's on is gated off, so it's difficult to get onto the land as well. But this area is only 45 minutes outside of Johannesburg. And so it's close to one of the biggest cities in Africa. You've got these incredible sites. But it's one of those circumstances where even if you took somebody with malintent and said, okay, go find some hominid fossils, there are people who've been doing this for decades and haven't found one. So it's difficult to do. But as we find more and more of these hotspots, it is becoming, we're becoming more and more aware of the possibility of these becoming sites that could be places where people could go and steal fossils and try to sell them on eBay or something. And it's horrifying, but that happens in paleontology. So dinosaur fossils are common enough that happens. And so I think we now are reaching a point where we're finding enough fossils and getting good at finding the sites that this is going to become something we're going to have to contend with. Not yet, I don't think. But yeah, if there was an easier to access site, then maybe.
We have time for 2 more questions.
So, right here, excuse me.
Yeah.
So thank you for your presentation. This was wonderful. One comment and then a question. I loved I'm an economist myself and so by training, and so I love the scientific inquiry piece. And I loved how technology, right, before Google Maps, but you had to still figure out the tree piece. Right, that's how you then identify these caves, right? But the technology sort of helps you do that. Do you have anybody with a public health background or like public health historian background? The reason why I asked I spend a lot of time with public health people, and your idea around the cemetery, around the body disposal piece and it being deliberate, you might want to talk to, if you don't, you might want to talk to some public health people because they may could look at this and say, give you some more clues as to, the kind of, was there a plague and people were sick and there was a disposal there, people were, because you said, you have the multiple ages, right? Young people, old people. The idea that the other person mentioned that was there more of a dominant, right, species that was disposing of people, but just my gut is from hearing what you're saying in that description, and that's where I thought too, a cemetery.
Yeah,
but
there are folks that have that kind of experience, that have seen those sorts of situations, and absolutely.
Yeah, because I have a colleague who does a history of public health going back hundreds and thousands of years, and there might be an interesting connection. So thank you again.
We have folks who do paleoforensics. We have folks who really study what happens to bones after an individual dies. And there are all these body farms. You probably heard about body farms, where there's one in Tennessee where they just put bodies out and do experiments to see what happens with a body in these different situations. And it's helped solve all these cases around the world. But now we need those people to lend their expertise to something like this. Could get at more the story around, was there a plague? Exactly. The narrative. Exactly. That's a great idea. I don't think we have anyone like that. That's a fabulous idea. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Can you be certain the dimensions and the 7-inch gap is the same today as it was a million years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am not a geologist. I'm not trained as a geologist. We have plenty of geologists in the team. And their expectation was that, we're going to find another route into the chamber. We're going to find that at one point there was a big gap in the rock over here, and everything slid in, and that's how this all happened. And they have gone through this chamber as carefully as they can. There was a geologist that could squeeze through and got in there, and found what he found in the chamber itself was an unbroken layer of chert all the way across the ceiling. And so if there was ever another opening, it would have disturbed the chert layer. And by having that undisturbed layer of chert, it means the chamber itself has always been sealed to the outside. And then you look around and you say, well, what are the entry points in? And that seems to be the only one, is this 7-inch gap. Now, might it have been a little bit larger? Yeah. The problem you run into there is if it's too large, then what's stopping scavengers from getting in there and munching on all these dead bodies, right? So then you would have little jackals sniffing out these bodies and saying, I like, and off they go. And not only can they get the smell, but there's enough light that can penetrate through that they can go down there safely. So we think instead that the geologists are agreeing with this, that this area was probably, maybe not restricted to the point where it was 7 inches all the time. Maybe it was 9. But it was never easy. That there was some distance between the bodies and the animals that could have disturbed that system, so that the animals stayed away. What also stayed away was dust from the outside, and so the inside was the folks working on the soil composition down there, what they found is that it's made up of stuff from the inside of the cave. So the cave itself has sort of crumbled over the years and filters down onto the floor, and that's what the soil surrounding these bodies is made of. If there was ever a huge opening to the outside, you'd get dust storms that blow sand in, you get stuff blown in, and it would settle down, and we have no evidence of that at all. So it seems to have always been tough to get to. It's weird. It's awesome. Oh, yeah.
Well, that was actually were there any evidence of geological shifts or geological disasters that would have moved the chamber from one area?
Not really. I mean, it's an active area. It's an active area, but it's not active like the Rift Valley in East Africa is. In East Africa, you've got volcanic eruptions, you've got shifts. They're on tectonic plates there, so things are moving. And you can have these, like there are sites in East Africa that are amazing that you'll be following this layer of lake deposit, and maybe there's a soil deposit underneath it, and there's a volcanic layer, and you're walking across and you're mapping them, and then they're gone. It's just like, where'd they go? And you look up and it's, they're up there now. Wow, that this whole area just went, not in South Africa, it's not volcanic. And so in South Africa, we just have this slow trickling of slightly acidic groundwater going through the limestone and slowly dissolving it and forming these caves over a long, long, long period of time. The last 3 million years, we think, is the cave formation time. But not any of these dramatic changes, just a slow trickling. So we're trying to date the cave itself. That's key. Nothing can be in the cave if there's no cave. So we're dating the cave itself. And that's yeah, because you get the formation, you get the stalactites and stalagmites. So you can get the limestone, because the limestone has in it radioactive uranium from the groundwater. So the groundwater comes through, deposits the radioactive uranium, and uranium decays to lead in 2 different versions, so where the X's cross is where your date is. So that's what we're doing for the cave itself. And we're getting some interesting, promising results. Yeah.
You made me think of something. You talked about predators and scavengers. So the 7-inch gap would preclude them, but did you see any evidence in the pre-caves, in the entrance caves, of any scavengers? Would you find that?
In some of the other caves?
Yeah, and the entrance cave. No, entrance caves to this one. That shows that they could smell out the. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, were there like bones of any other animals or anything like that?
Or even scratch marks showing that they could smell this and try to get at
them? So I don't know if we've looked for that sort of detail, the scratch marks or something like that. There are no bones from other animals, so there are no scavenger or carnivore bones in the vicinity at all. Other caves have them, sure, but not this one. So there is a team that's looking at residues. In part, they're looking for fire residue. They're saying, geez, if these things are going down into the dark zone, it's going to be dark down there. If they're carrying a body with them, they need to have lit the area. So they're looking for fire residue and not finding much. It's a huge mystery. But it's a fun one. It's one of those that, you guys are asking questions. You guys seem interested in it. I mean, can you imagine the students, right? I pitch this to the students, and they just, they're so excited about it. And they'll, after class, they'll come in and they'll say, well, maybe it's this. And I'll say, well, yeah, maybe. And how do you test that? Like, how would you scientifically evaluate that? And they think about it, and they leave. And then, 3 days later, Sarah's back, and she's like, well, here's how I test it. And she's got an idea, and it's awesome. That's an honors thesis. That's how we're going to build this. This is the kind of project that we're going to be working on with Dartmouth students for decades.